do one.
I'm just waiting for the attendees to be in. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Adirondack Experience and the Adirondack Diversity Initiative's discussion on the Black experience in the Adirondacks. This is the first in the fall opening of the continued discussion about the Black experience in the Adirondacks. I'm Dr. Nicole Hylton-Patterson, Executive Director at the Adirondack Initiative, and I will be joined tonight by Dr. Eliza Jane Darling. Now, Dr. Darling's work as a sociocultural anthropologist, she's the public historian for Hamilton County and the Town of Hope, and teaches at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Now, just some housekeeping before we invite Dr. Darling, Eliza, to come and speak to us about race and the lynching of a Black male in the Adirondacks. So for the audience this evening, if you would like to submit a question during this program, please remember to submit it through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Again, if you want to submit a question, please do during the talk or even after. Use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. For questions that are not addressed this evening, ADI, the Adirondack Diversity Initiative, would add more information to its website, along with a link to a recording of this evening's discussion. If you're having any trouble during this live stream, feel free to post a question to the Q&A, and a staff person will provide guidance. And as always, we will make these recordings available not just on our website, Adirondack Diversity Initiatives, but also on the Adirondack Experience website, as well as our YouTube channel. Okay, so I want to thank you all for being with us tonight. It is, of course, snowing. What the hell? Hello. Somebody should have told me that it would begin snowing this quickly in the Adirondacks. And so, but before that, I just want to give a little preamble to Eliza, Dr. Darling's talk today. It's dealing with a very dark period in American history, the mass lynching of Black bodies post-emancipation. And so I taught a class several years ago in Intro to African American Studies, where I used an installation that was at the Schomburg Museum in Harlem, New York, called Without Sanctuaries. And I would encourage those of you who are with us tonight to take a look at withoutsanctuaries.com. And it's our wonderful support staff have put up the website for you to take a look at. And in that instance, you will see we are actually increasingly graphic and traumatic and terrifying images of lynchings as part of a spectacle in American life were used as postcards and sent around the country. And Without Lynching was an opportunity to bring a focus on the ways in which humanity was not always accessible to all Americans or even all bodies. And so I am very excited about what Eliza is going to, pardon me, Eliza or Eliza, you'll tell me how to pronounce it once you activate your mic. Talk about what that meant, like what that looked like, and what that was about right here in the Adirondacks during that time period. Eliza, Eliza, welcome. I apologize sincerely. Please take over.
Okay, thank you, Nikki. And thanks very much to the museum and the initiative for having me. Can everyone see my slides? We good? Okay, then I'm going to go ahead and start. And it's Eliza, by the way. So this talk is about an incident that took place over 3 days in 1932, from March 2nd to March 4th, in the central Adirondacks, roundabout the area of Blue Mountain. And I'm going to show you a couple of maps in just a few minutes. Now, in early March of that year, 2 white trappers from Blue Mountain Lake encountered a black man in the middle of the woods whom they felt was living rough. He had his sort of wrapped up in deer hides and looked as though he had been out in the wilderness for quite some time. Now, what happened next after they encountered this man is really the heart of the story. And I'm going to give you 2 different versions that people have told of it. But for now, let me say that the 2 white trappers retreated, they left the mountains, they went back to town, and they reported this incident to the authorities. The authorities, which then included state troopers, game protectors, who, if you're not familiar with sort of how the state works in the Adirondacks, are employed by the Department of Environmental Conservation, and these civilians, as well as several others, went into the woods. They tracked this man from Blue across Minerva and over to Newcomb. And again, I'll show you a map in just a second, where they found him again and shot him to death. Now, after this, there was a cursory attempt to figure out his identity, to find out if he had sort of any clues on his person that would tell them who he was, but he was in the end never identified. He was removed from the area where he was shot on a toboggan, on a sled, and then he was trucked over to North Creek, where he was buried and remains to this day without an identity. A coroner's inquest, and this was in not Hamilton County where we are now, but in the next county, sort of kitty corner to the north, which is Essex County. And that coroner's inquest absolved all of these men involved of wrongdoing. And for the most part, the story sat there until the 1970s. Now, when the museum asked me to do this talk, I told them that I would do it, although the research is somewhat preliminary. This is supposed to be published in Adirondack Life magazine. That's who I was doing the research for. I publish occasionally with them. But since it fits in so well with the series on the Black experience in the Adirondacks, I said I would go ahead and do it. And indeed, unfortunately, from 90 years ago, we still see some of the exact same racist contours, racist practices, and racist discourses in this case as well as in cases in the present day. So this is a long-term project that I've been working on. I just want to show you where I am. These are the elements that tell us what happened in 1932. The case was widely reported in newspapers as far away as Chicago, so it was quite sensationalized. I'm going to show you some of those headlines in just a few moments. Photographs were taken at the scene, and I will give you a warning before those come up. There were several official reports, including the coroner's inquest that I talked about. There's an absolutely fascinating secondary source that was written by a guy named Mitivia, who was a Glens Falls Post-Star journalist who went back and interviewed some of the men involved in 1976. There are local repositories that may or may not include information on this. I haven't quite got that far. I've been putting together biographies of the men involved. And then there's local and family memory, and I have been able to tap into some of that at this point. So the official logs are some of the most important clues here. And the one you're seeing here is just a plain cover. This is a logbook that was kept by one of the game protectors. His name was Merritt Lamos, and he was from the town of Long Lake. This was just a typical log that someone working for ANCA in his position would have kept at the time. And fortunately, his family preserved this logbook and donated it to the, I believe it was the Long Lake Historical Society, along with 17 others just like it. And the incident was recorded in this book. Another official report was compiled by the state police a couple of days after the incident. Now, this man was killed on the 4th, and this special report was put together on the 9th. And I found it appended to the coroner's report, which is a 70-page document that comprises primarily interviews with the men who were involved in this action. And here's the Mitivia book which recounts the interviews from 1976 done by the journalist with the Glens Falls Post-Star. This book was actually published in 1993, but the interviews were done in 1976 for a Saturday morning column that this guy had in the paper at the time. The resulting account is really quite fascinating because it is vastly different from the original testimony that was given to the coroner under oath back in 1932. It essentially rewrites that crucial moment at the beginning of this story when these white trappers encounter this black man living rough in the wilderness. And I'm going to tell you more about those specific accounts in just a moment. So this is kind of what the research is trying to do. In the first place, I'm trying to reconstruct what exactly happened. And given the conflicting accounts, that is actually quite a job. How was the killing explained at the time? That's another element of this. Was the killing justified, and was it a lynching? Now, as this research goes on, it becomes more apparent to me that this was quite a complicated case, and it is entirely possible that some of the men did not have all of the information that others had or were lied to, but I'll explain that in just a moment. The question about it being justified, I think, is easily answered. It absolutely was not. Not only was this an extremely racist episode in the history of Hamilton and Essex counties, but it was also a case of terrible police bungling, as you'll see as I describe in detail exactly what happened. Finally, who was the victim? I think that after almost 90 years, it is time to return the identity of this man to him, if that is possible. So that is one of the major goals of this research as well, because he still lies in a grave without a name. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to some of the maps so that you can sort of locate where we are. Now on the left here, we have Hamilton County with the town of Indian Lake picked out in red. And on the right, we have Newcomb, which is a town in this county, which is Essex. So they sort of fit together. And in this particular incident, the hunt began in Indian Lake in a region called Blue Mountain, and then it proceeded across this weird little triangle of Minerva and into the town of Newcomb, which is where they killed the man. So here's a topo map that will be familiar to many if you know the Central Adirondacks. Here's Blue Mountain Lake, here's Blue Mountain. Okay, and from Blue Mountain, they camped at a hunting camp here, this is hunters, at O'Neill Flow. And they set out every day on the night of March 3rd and March 2nd to find this man, always tracking him in a northeasterly direction toward Dunbrook Mountain, crossing the Indian Lake border over into Minerva and Essex County, and then finally, I believe, ending up somewhere over here in the vicinity of Goodnow Mountain. Now, they called it Donnelly Mountain, the place where he was killed in the coroner's report. I've not yet been able to place that on a map, but I have someone at the DC who is looking in that. Now, part of the reason why they knew where they were when the killing took place is that one of the men involved, a gamekeeper, a game protector named Farrell, had worked on a survey in this area around 1910, 1911, and he knew exactly where he was. And so he placed them over in Newcomb on this place called Donnelly Mountain, and not in fact too far from the highway. They literally chased him from Blue Mountain all the way over near Route 28N by the hamlet of Newcomb. Okay. So let me describe to you exactly who was involved in this. Now, I told you at the beginning that there were two trappers from Blue Mountain Lake who were out trapping in the woods on the other side of Blue Mountain, on the east side of Blue Mountain, and encountered this man. Now, one story, the one that is put down in the coroner's report and the state police report, say that these two men were Ernest Blanchard and Lester Turner. They were out trapping, they encountered this man, and their tale was that he said to them, "Don't come any closer, as I don't want to kill you." That's exactly the quote that they gave to the coroner's inquest, after which they retreated. They went and found Merritt Lamos and A.J. Hall, who was a state trooper, went back into the woods, and then the rest of these men joined them over time. Okay, so in the Mitivia account, the trappers have changed into Richard Farrell, Dick Carroll, who was a caretaker at the hunting camp where they were staying during the hunt. and Reg Springs, his cousin. Reg is not mentioned in the coroner's report at all. So this is an absolutely huge mystery, that the cast of characters has changed from 1932 to 1976, but more concerning, the story has changed. The story that was told to McDonald and Gauss, who were the Essex County authorities who investigated this, is very different from the story that the men later told to Mitivia. So here's the timeline more specifically. On March 2nd, one of these pairs of trappers encounters this guy in the woods. Now, according to Turner and Blanchard, he ran to a tree, picked up a shotgun, pointed it at them, and said, "Don't come any closer. I don't want to kill you." Okay. According to the other two, to Reg Spring and Dick Farrell, he didn't have a gun. They were staying in a camp there. He looked in the window and then he vanished. Now, I can't impress upon you how important the difference here is, because in one account, this man threatened these two people out in the woods, and in the other, he did no such thing. There was no gun and there was no threat. He simply looked in the window and then ran away. Okay, whichever one happened, the two pairs retreated and regrouped with the authorities, went back into the woods and began the search for this man. Once they picked up his tracks, this is important to note, the civilians did not leave the party. They continued on with them. I don't exactly know what the explanation for that is. I suppose it's plausible that the trappers wanted to show the authorities exactly where this had happened. However, once they picked up the traps, it was unnecessary. And certainly it's not as though they were, needing to point out this man among all the other Black men who were living rough out on Blue Mountain Lake. So it's a bit inexplicable that the civilians were allowed to continue on with this party, but they were. And by March 4th, this party had grown to 9 people. Okay. Now, the police bungling comes in at this point. The troopers were led by one Lieutenant McCann. He was supposed to be the leader of this posse and the one who was in charge of the operation to bring this man back to civilization. McCann and Trooper Donnellan got stuck in the snow at one point, according to McCann's report to the coroner's inquest. Apparently, they weren't terribly good at using snowshoes. They were troopers rather than game protectors. They weren't really used to the backwoods. The rest of the party continued on following this man's tracks toward Donnelly Mountain. And at some point, Scouria, who was also a state trooper, gave his long gun to one of the civilians, Turner. He'd been carrying 2, a .45 pistol and a .30-30 Winchester. He gave the Winchester to one of the civilians. In fact, one of the civilians who had accused this man of threatening them to begin with. They see him caught up with this guy at Donnelly Mountain. And then the story becomes like something out of a dime store novel. The men reported that he said, "You'll never take me alive, boys," and then picked up his gun and started shooting at them, apparently hitting Turner, the civilian with the cop's gun who was shooting at him, in the hip, the bullet being stopped by a wallet, which was never later produced for evidence. The remaining men closed in around this guy and they shot him to death. He took 5 bullets, I believe it was, in the end. So let me return just for a moment to the initial encounter, because I think that if we are to make any judgment as to the justification of not only shooting this man, but actually setting out in the woods after him to begin with, it's really quite crucial to understand what exactly happened when these two trappers came upon the man in the woods. So this is a direct quote from McCann in the state police report that was made on March 9th of that year. On March 2nd, while hunting in the woods about 1 mile from the village of Blue Mountain Lake, Ernest Blanchard and Lester Turner were confronted by a Negro, roughly dressed and having deerskin hide on his feet. The Negro ran toward them, arms uplifted till he reached a tree. He grabbed a gun standing against same and ran behind a boulder at the same time, pointing the shotgun at them and ordered them not to come any nearer, as he did not want to kill them. They retraced their steps and came out of the woods. So this was the version that was told in 1932, and it is somewhat supported by Merritt Lamos's notebook for the entry on March 2nd. Received telephone, crossed out, complaint from E. Blanchard. So Merritt Lamos actually recorded this complaint, but he didn't give any details about it. So it's not clear if there is any other evidence that this man actually threatened the cops or not. Now, this is a very, very different account from the one that was given to the journalist on Mitivia in 1976. Here he's told a very different story. Two cousins, Dick Farrell and Red Springs of Blue Mountain Lake, were trapping in the O'Neill Flow area. The two trappers found a cabin near O'Neill Flow and were going up to the loft to sleep when they saw something looking in the window. And by the way, this chapter is called Adirondack Bigfoot. They described it as a huge creature covered with hair from head to foot, and it left a large footprint in the snow as it ran away. It should be noted that both men agreed the creature ran away and had only looked in the window of the cabin. Farrell and Springs went into either Blue Mountain Lake or Indian Lake and contacted Farrell's brother, Conservation Officer Jack Farrell, who wound up being on the posse as well. A posse was organized and went into the O'Neill Flow area to search for the creature. So it's not uncommon for critical moments like this one to be remembered differently even today. However, this one is remembered so differently that it really casts doubt on all of the accounts. And I do have to wonder how much of the truth has come out at all, because these are so incredibly different. So if the first moment that really weighs heavily in our judgment of whether or not chasing this man across the mountains was justified, we then have to look at his end. And this is a quote from Sergeant Edward Scouria, who was the New York State Trooper who handed his Winchester to the civilian, Turner, who then was one of the men who shot this, the victim in the end. And here you can see that the polite term, more polite term, Negro has been dropped. And I'm going to read this, I'm going to say the word, and I would only say this under an academic circumstance because it is such an evil and powerful word. So Scouria reports of this man's end. And remember, at this point, McCann and Connolly, they're back here stuck in the snow. So the guy who's actually supposed to be leading this posse is nowhere near the scene of the shooting. He went down on his knees. He rolled over and said, "You got me that time, boss, but I will fight until I die." And he went down. They hollered to leave his gun down. He pulled his leg around and spotted Turner coming up from the knoll. After we paced that off, he was 13 paces from the nigger. When the nigger dropped the shotgun, he reached over his shoulder. He had another gun across his back and pulled it over his shoulder and let drive at Turner. Turner dropped over a little knoll and his hips were over the knoll. The nigger fired and Turner grabbed himself with, I think, the right hand in the hip. Then 2 or 3 more shots were fired and he went down. So this is the account of the man's end, which essentially says that they asked him to stop. There is no indication that they identified themselves as police. So these were merely 9 men chasing this guy through the woods. In response, the report was, he told them that he was not going to be taken alive, that he would die fighting, and then proceeded to do so by shooting at them first. So this is the story that came out in 1932. This is the story that was told at the coroner's inquest. And I would like to remind you that no censures were produced at all by this inquest, despite the fact that a police officer had handed his gun to a civilian who then went on to shoot the suspect whom he himself had accused of wrongdoing. Now, I have never seen any era of American history in which that would be considered acceptable policing. In the United States of America, when someone goes to a police station, we do not hand them a policeman's gun and say, "Go take care of it yourself." But that is essentially what happened here. And it was determined later by the coroner that Turner, the civilian, using a cop's gun, his bullet had been the one that killed this man in the end. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the scene of the shooting. So I think there's like 1 or 2 slides left, but if before we get to that part, if you want to darken your screens, please do so now. There has been a conversation about how we show Black bodies, particularly in the media. And these conversations have, a couple of different purposes to them. Some of them are about whether depicting violence against Black bodies actually produces any progress towards social justice. Are people actually affected by these videos? The other issue is one of exploitation, given that lynching in particular in American history was a spectacle created for both entertainment and for terror, for terrorizing the Black population. Do we have a sort of moral case for showing these things? Now, I discussed this with the museum and with Nikki, and I wanted to explain why we decided to show these pictures. They are not bloody. You cannot see this man's wounds. It's black and white and sepia, and it's not the goriest thing. There are terribly gory pictures out there. Nikki mentioned an exhibition of one, I think took place in 2002, but these aren't that bad. What I want to show you here, the point of this, is to see how this man's death and the violence against him was casualized. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the pictures now. Now, the first picture, he's not in it. I must have a dozen pictures like this in my office at Hamilton County. The Adirondack Museum probably has hundreds, if not thousands. This just looks like an ordinary hunting party. A bunch of guys out hunting, they've got their snowshoes, until you realize that their quarry is a human being. This is the picture that I first came upon in my office when I began this research. And when I first looked at it, it was just on a negative, and I was sort of peering at it and trying to figure out what it was. And I thought it was a wilderness rescue at first. This man is being displayed like a trophy. I don't know how else to put this. These pictures were not taken for purposes of the coroner. In fact, they were not even mentioned in the coroner's report. After they left the scene and came back to get him, the coroner who did the investigation never actually went to the scene. So any investigation of this thing was not actually done by the investigating officer. They were able to take these pictures, and I'm not sure that the coroner knew about them at all. Okay, here's another one with him on the toboggan. Now, someone else did come to the scene, and that was the Indian Lake coroner. We only know that because he told Mitivia, the journalist, that in 1976. He said, it was probably illegal what I did, but I went to the scene. He was from Indian Lake, and he was the acting coroner for Hamilton County at the time. And it was his son's sled that they used to take this man out of the woods. So I wanted to stop here for a moment and be very clear that what you were looking at here is a young man, despite the depiction of him as some sort of a comedy criminal, as they did in the papers, which you'll see in a moment. He was a young man with a mother and a father and a life and a name and a story. But the way he is depicted in these pictures, and this is not at all accidental, this is purposeful, is comparable to that of an animal. And I'd like you to think for a moment about how this man died. He was literally hunted down. The way they put it in the papers, and the papers caught wind of this before he was even killed. The article started coming out on March 4th before he died. They said they were going to run him to ground, which is what you do with an animal. Now, if he had indeed been living out in the Central Adirondacks in March, this is a very unforgiving time of year. It is unlikely that this man was in a very healthy state. He was most likely malnourished. No medical supplies were found on him. He didn't have a bandage to, bind an injury. He didn't have an aspirin to relieve any pain. He was most likely in bad shape. And then he was chased by 9 men, most of them armed, across the mountains until he met his end at their hands. This was a terrible way to die. He died alone, far from anyone he knew, hunted and terrified. This photograph is an absolutely remarkable one. The museum had this one, and I believe they told me that it was on a slightly different roll, or it seemed to be set apart from the others. In case I have to point this out, there's a child in this photograph. He's right here in the center, and I'm going to guess that he's maybe 5 or 6 years old. It's a little bit difficult to tell, and there's a dog down here that looks like a puppy as well. I have not yet been able to identify this boy, though I have a feeling that he might be John Carroll, who was the son of the acting Hamilton County coroner who lent the sled. At any rate, whoever he was, someone thought that it was a good idea to bring a little boy to see a dead black man who had been shot down in the woods. So if this scene is sort of missing in the typical spectacle that we see in public lynchings, I think that these photographs, to a certain extent, make up for that fact. postcards, as Nikki said, used to be made out of lynching scenes. I have not yet seen any from these photographs, but I cannot say that I would be terribly surprised if I did. Now, in asking around Indian Lake, a rumor that I have heard is that this man's body was shown around town in the back of a pickup or some sort of truck after they took him out of the woods. Now, they had to come from Newcomb, go through Long Lake, through Indian Lake, and thus to North Creek. So it's entirely possible that it could have been any of those towns. I can't confirm this. It's a rumor that's been floating around for some time, but after seeing these images, I'm going to put some credence in that. Okay, so if anyone's got their screen darkened, I'm back into regular slides and I've stopped showing the photos of the corpse. So I want to talk a little bit about the kinds of strategies that we see for routinizing or normalizing white terror against people of color, and particularly Black people in the United States. And when I first put this slide together, I put people of color, and then I put BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, or people of color. But I changed it back to Black only because I have this sort of, working theory as an anthropologist who studies the United States, that there is a particular venom that is reserved for people who have been treated as property in previous historical epochs. It's not to contribute to the sort of oppression Olympics that people talk to, but there is a kind of viciousness with which Black people in particular in the United States have been treated. And I think that this is a classic example of this. So I've called these strategies because they're not accidents. Even if people are not conscious of doing these things, these are the kinds of discourses and practices which allow a nation to so horrifically brutalize an entire group of people, and which allowed for the brutalization of this man. So first and foremost, dehumanization. The comparison of Black people to animals is a classic strategy. Feralization. This is I think a term that was coined by an anthropologist a few years back. The construction of Black people as wild savages. You especially see this in discourses around urbanism and cities in the third world. Deracination. The excommunication of Black people from public space. Now, ostensibly, this man had every right to be out in the woods. That's what the Adirondack Park is for. There is some suggestion that for a while he might have been on Finch-Proyne land, but so were the trappers. Everybody was using Finch-Proyne land at the time. But this man was obviously out of place in the wilderness because he was Black. And that is a strategy we have not lost yet. Pathologization, the supposition that a Black person out of place is mentally ill. This guy was called crazy in the press. You're going to see those headlines in just a moment. Criminalization, the suspicion of criminal wrongdoing. This guy was simply assumed to be a fugitive from justice. Alienation, the denial of the entitlements of citizenship to Black suspects. In this case, certainly the right to due process. These people acted as judge, jury, and executioner, and they had already presumed him to be guilty before they set out into the woods after him. Overestimation, the invention or overestimate of a threat. This man was called a giant Negro with a foot span 30 inches long in the papers. As it turned out, he was about 5'6" and 140 pounds. He was a little guy. Overreaction, which involves disproportionate response, which I think, depending again on how you understand the initial encounter, if he threatened someone with a gun, even though he said, I don't want to kill you, I suppose perhaps there's a justification for telling the authorities. If all he did was look in a window, then this man was basically killed for looking for a place to sleep at night. Transposition, blaming Black victims for their own injury and death. Now, this is all over this case. Essentially, these people were trying to sell a story of suicide by cop. You'll never take me alive, boys. I'll go down fighting, that kind of thing. I have no idea if it's true. I'm dubious. And finally, casualization, the devaluation of Black life and death. Now, on that note, I wanted to give you a sort of another visual depiction. This is from Merritt Lamos's notebook. He, again, was the game protector who was a part of the posse and had been in the hunt from the very beginning. If you look down at the very bottom, this is March 3rd and March 4th, and he's sort of saying where he is, and you know, he's got all his mileage and his costs down, and at the bottom, he just says, Negro killed. next to his expenses for those 2 days, which were $9.96. It's just a sort of casual mention that he killed a man. Okay, and now I'm going to go on to some of these newspaper reports. As I said, and I don't know how this happened. I don't know if journalists were to just simply call around at the state police barracks and find out what was happening, or if one of the men contacted the press. I have no idea. But certainly the papers caught wind of it by the 4th, but before the man was killed. And here's a very typical headline that uses some of those strategies that I just talked about. Indian Lake troopers terrorized by man clad in deerskin. State troopers, game protectors, and guides today hunted the vast fastness of the snow-covered Adirondacks near Indian Lake for a wild man fugitive roaming through the section and terrorizing guides and trappers with a sawed-off shotgun. I can establish no evidence for any of that. I can establish no evidence that he terrorized anyone, that he had a sawed-off shotgun. He did appear to have 2 guns in the end, but he either looked in a window or told 2 people to stay away from them because he did not want to kill them. Remember, this man was killed for not wanting to kill someone else, if that's the version of the story that's true. Now, here's some of the other headlines. Seek wild man, Indian Lake. You see the dehumanization. And the terrible irony here is that they're calling him a wild man, but he's out in the wilderness. So if he's out in the wilderness and he's a wild man, then, you know, he should be in his right place, right? But of course, this speaks to the horrific truth that for Black Americans in public space, there is no place. There is no place at all. Some of the other headlines, escaped convict, that was never ever proven. Slain in mountain fight, mysterious fugitive proves to be giant Negro. He wasn't, he turned out when they sort of peeled back the layers of deerskin and clothing to be a quite small man. This one is quite interesting here. Negro backwoodsman of Adirondacks elects death in gun battle to capture. So transposition, he is blamed here for his own death. Insanity is mentioned down here. That was also never proven. And Mad Trapper is giving you the same kind of idea. So bearing in mind that some of these papers had these headlines out before the man was even killed, you know, he was dehumanized and externalized before they even finally took his life. Okay. And here's a classic. So there was an inspector in the DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation, named Leland. And although he was not part of the group that hunted this man down and killed him, he leapt to their defense afterwards, saying that, look, you know, they had to get their man. He argued that this guy was shooting deer out of season, which of course no one could possibly have known until they came upon him, and no one could possibly have proven. But one of the really interesting ways that he justified this was to appeal to the time-honored threat, sexual threat, that Black men ostensibly posed to white women. And he said, this man's tracks showed he had been within a short distance of the main highway. I am wondering what would have happened had it been summer and the wife of some critic had been picking berries all alone when this desperate Negro appeared. So, you know, from Emmett Till right on up to the present day, that is another way to dehumanize Black men, is to accuse them of, you know, animals who simply cannot control themselves and attack our innocent white virgins. Okay. So I wanted to just point out, I could go on with this section of the talk for it. I want to give a chance for questions. I could have done hundreds of slides here, but I'm going to give you a few recent killings of Black men and boys, which give you that same sense of strategies that are being used in order to justify this violence and this death. So Tammy Rice is a classic one. He was a 12-year-old boy who was playing with a toy gun in a park, as millions of American children have done before him. He was shot point blank in the abdomen by an officer 2 seconds after he arrived in the scene, and he reported that the boy was 20 years old. He was actually 12. So there's a classic case of overestimation of a threat. Elijah McClain, this is an absolutely terrible, terrible situation. This 23-year-old young man was just walking down the street. Someone called in and said that he looked sketchy. The police came, he was attacked. He was put in a particular kind of hold called a carotid hold until he vomited and then passed out. And he was injected by paramedics with ketamine. He passed out, went to the hospital, and died a few days later. Like the unknown man in the case in Newcomb, he was actually quite tiny. He was 5'6", 140 pounds. But the police said that he was acting crazy, like he had a crazy kind of strength. So madness, again, comes in as a way to humanize people. And of course, Trayvon Martin, who was killed by a self-appointed neighborhood watch man named George Zimmerman when he was only 17 years old. He'd gone to the store to get candy. He was visiting his father's place, and he walked back, and Zimmerman literally says, "There's something wrong with him. It's raining," and he's walking around as if Black people don't go out in the rain. It was a really weird case of deracination, in the sense that this kid didn't belong on the street, just walking down to the store to get some Skittles. Okay, going back to the case at hand, when you look at this in its totality, and I can't even get to all of the absurdities of it, the initial claims made by the so-called posse really read like they came out of a dime store novel. You'll never take me alive, boys. The idea that he, really wished to be killed by this posse rather than being taken alive. There's no evidence for that. It is claimed to this very day that this man had been caught breaking into camps and even burning some down. Those accusations were never made until after he was killed. I can find no evidence whatsoever that he broke into anyone's camp or burned down anything. This was made up, I believe, by one of the posse afterward. The gamekeepers, as Leland said, had to bring him in for violating game laws. They had no idea that he was violating game laws. He was living on the backside of Blue Mountain, and no one knew what he was doing until the trappers bumped into him. And then finally, that 9 men were required to chase this guy through the woods because he said he didn't want to kill someone. I have to wonder here, if that is the truth, if that is the story that actually happened, I have to wonder what would have happened if he had been white. Personally, I've seen more heated disputes at Little League games. I have yet to find a contemporary story, but I can give you some recent examples of white threats that did not result in anyone being hunted down. The McCluskeys in St. Louis, who of course threatened to shoot some Black Lives Matter protesters who were marching through their neighborhood. Kyle Rittenhouse, who did kill two Black Lives Matter protesters. And then these protesters with the guns are at the Kentucky State House and the Michigan State House because they didn't want to wear masks. So I think that one of the things that we have to ask ourselves when we encounter cases like this is, what if that dispute between 2 trappers and another guy who was out there, what if that had been a white guy instead of a Black man? And personally, I think, having seen conflicting accounts openly being told, and having seen the lack of evidence for many of the accusations made against this man, I have to say that if he had been white, there would be no story here. Okay, there are a couple of other questions, and I'm going to end very soon, about the way that this case was handled. The fact that civilians were allowed to track this man and even shoot him with a police weapon, and that was never punished. As I said, that is quite preposterous. I've never seen anything like that go unpunished. Why a child was at the scene, why no one mentioned that a child was at the scene or mentioned that the coroner from Indian Lake was at the scene, none of that ever came into the inquest. The wallet that proved that this guy actually shot at Turner, that was never produced. He just took it home, and it was not asked for. So basically, there is no evidence at all that was offered to the coroner, to the investigators, that this man shot at anyone. There's no evidence whatsoever. And finally, why the story told to Mitivia years later was so drastically different. Okay, there is one similarity to shootings of Black men in America in the present day that I also want to point out that is a more positive thing. This incident did not go uncriticized. In fact, the reason why there was a coroner's inquest at all is because there were public complaints, and the Glens Falls Post-Star led the charge. They published this on March 15th, before the inquest, obviously, because it was partly the impetus for it. And they said, "The giant is dead." So they're obviously harping on the fact that it turned out this man was very small. It seems to the Post-Star that this killing reflects discreditably upon the state police. We think that the killing was unnecessary and unwarranted. The feeling that many people have is that the officials unnecessarily killed an unfortunate person whose station in life, they were aware, was not such as would result in influential survivors protesting the act violently after he was dead. For the sake of an efficient policing of the state and in the name of reasonable, humane social attitude toward breakers of the law, if he did break the law, we protest the slaying of the giant of the Adirondacks and demand that such methods no longer characterize the service of the guardians of society. Aside from the slightly stilted language of 1932, I think you could have seen this in an editorial a couple of days ago. And finally, they published a poem by a person, they just gave the initials JOS, and I don't know who it is, but I hope to find out, called Wake John Brown. And the thing that I love about this poem is that it references the hypocrisy of people like Blanchard, who became a well-known guide in the Indian Lake area, who simply wished to enjoy the quietude of the woods and the wildlife, but who denied that same life and that same enjoyment to the man that they shot to death. So I'll just read this and then I'll end. Old Essex men were a hardy breed who never felt an urgent need of running a stranger into the earth. They ran their own lives and knew the worth of solitude. If a man was right, he might be colored, he might be white. They left him alone to his own affairs so he didn't interfere with theirs. But the Negro lived in a camp in the woods and shot and fished for his daily food. It is not long since we all did the same, when the forests were teeming with fish and game, when there were no licenses, guards, or guides, and the first growth covered the mountainsides. So that is the story, and I'll turn it back over to Nikki for questions.
Thank you so much. This was elucidating in many ways. And we have many, many questions waiting. So I want to jump right into questions. But before that, could you, for me, I want to start with the use of the N-word in reading the quote. And I know you mentioned it, that you were doing it in the academic sense within the context. But the use of the N-word here as you're reading as a person who is white facing. Could you talk to me a little bit about that before we get to the other questions, please?
You mean about why I decided to do it?
Yeah, please.
So yeah, I went back and forth over whether to read that out loud, the whole thing, put a replacement word in, like the N-word or something like. In the end, I decided to do it for the same reason that I thought the photographs were important to show, which is to give the force of the text as it was spoken to the county coroner. I almost got the sense, because Negro, the word Negro is used in the entire rest of this testimony, but it's Scouria, this one man, it's almost like the veil drops and he is, not being careful, and he's speaking his mind, and he's saying exactly what he thinks of this human being whom he ran into the ground, as the papers said, and shot to death. So I did go back and forth. I don't tend to say that word at all. It's probably the first time I've ever said it. I felt that some of the story, when you're looking at the evidence, almost kind of leans toward, well, they threatened, this guy threatened these people in the woods. They had to tell somebody. There's almost a kind of a legitimacy that comes out of it, as if these men were doing the right thing as the law in tracking down someone who might be dangerous. But when you read that word and you see the way that Scouria put it, I think that you can see the attitude that was driving these men across the mountains, or at least him. I don't know if he spoke for the others, if that was in their minds as well. And this guy was simply not conscious enough to hide it. But it's the force of it is the reason why I said it, to give you a picture of what was really happening in the woods that year.
Okay, so I really do, for myself, and I've spoken to other Black academics and activists who struggle with the use of that word by our white allies and accomplices, even when it is meant to really convey the urgency or the trauma that is experienced by Black bodies within a context. And so this is the struggle that I have, right? So, and whether or not other Black and brown people in the audience feel the same way. Is it jarring to hear that come out of the mouth of a white academic, particularly someone who I consider to be an accomplice or an ally? But I'm gonna move on from that and go right to the questions. So here we are. So the first question, who comes from, this is an anonymous attendee. In grade school, the North is generally depicted as being not racist, or at least much less racist than the South. And it's always jarring to hear stories of these violent acts of racism, especially when they're local. Did lynchings like this happen often in this area?
To my knowledge, no. I looked up a list of lynchings. I'll have to go back and find the source, and there were only, I believe, 2 in that year, one of them in New York and one of them in the South. I don't know of other stories in this area, in the Adirondacks. This one stands out to me. Now, just because I don't know about it doesn't mean it didn't happen. I mean, certainly this story, you know, sort of stayed under the radar until 1976, when Mitivia started talking about it in his columns. But even then, nothing seems to have come to it. It was sort of published and then people moved on. So it's entirely possible, but I can't tell you of a similar one.
Okay, thank you. So I have a question here from Benita. Can the man's body be exhumed and have his DNA tested to establish his identity? I kept thinking about that too myself. What's the possibility of something like that happening?
So I spoke to a friend of mine who is our recently retired Hamilton County judge, Peter Feldstein, to ask him if there was any possibility of this case being reopened. I don't really know what to call it when it's not a cold case in the sense that it's unsolved. I think it's a cold case in the sense that it was solved wrong, and that justice has not been done. And that was sort of the question that I asked him, but along the same lines, I was thinking, you know, if someone who seems to be a relative might be found and there was some DNA to compare it to, could that happen? I think the case, he said, was unlikely to be reopened because the principal players they're gone. They're long dead at this point. But I don't see why, you know, if we could obtain the proper permission, had something to which to compare the DNA, that couldn't happen. Certainly, I think it is in the interest of this man who was killed and in the interest of justice in general, that he be identified. So there was an attempt, I think it was on the part of the Chicago Defender, which is one of the oldest Black newspapers in the United States and still going to this very day, to identify him, and they came up with a name. So that part of my research I've not actually gotten to yet, because I'm still in this part of establishing exactly what happened amidst all the conflicting reports. He might have, I believe, they thought he may have gone missing from a prison or a chain gang or something like that. So that's something I, you know, will certainly be following up in the future. But with DNA, there has to be something to which to compare it. Otherwise, it's interestingly, when they attempted to find out who this man was, one of the first places they reported calling was the War Department in Washington, which is the precursor to, more or less, our Department of Defense today. And the coroner identified wounds on this man's body which were old. And I, just sort of putting 2 and 2 together, I wondered if they thought he might be a veteran. He seemed too young. They placed him somewhere around 35, but it's possible. But all they had at that point was fingerprints. And I think they sent them to Albany, to Department of Corrections, the War Department, and nothing came up at that time. It wasn't an extensive search, though.
Thank you. This question is from Marianne Herbert. And Marianne wants to know, I'm curious how this event compares with the many reports of hermits and recluse living in the Adirondack woods. She goes on to say they were myths and idolized for being independent rather than threatening. Were other wild men considered threats to citizens? Some were considered to be mentally unsound. Can you speak to us a little bit about that and the difference
Yeah.
To be considered a wild man and a myth, living rough, as opposed to a black body who's considered a threat.
Yeah, I have a stack of newspaper articles about other wild men. I didn't find one specifically in the Adirondacks, but sort of close by in places like Vermont and Massachusetts. These were men who were painted as incredibly mythical creatures of absolutely gigantic proportions who ate raw flesh and would, sort of creep into houses at night and steal babies and that sort of thing. These were frequently mentioned in the papers. They were so fantastical that it's difficult to know, exactly what to make of them. This man, I think, was constructed sort of discursively as a wild man after they discovered him. In some cases, long after the fact. Now, I said that Mitivia did those interviews in 1976, and he called his story, this chapter, the Adirondack Bigfoot. And it almost sounds as though the people he interviewed played into that idea and said, oh, he was massively hairy and, very shaggy. And none of that came out to begin with. I think the difference is I have found no evidence that anyone knew about this guy until the two trappers came upon him. Much later, people said, oh yeah, everybody knew there was a wild man living in the woods, but they didn't. And no one knew of him until, whether it was Blanchard and his partner or the other two who came upon him. This was kind of like a wild man after the fact kind of thing. So I think that maybe that distinguishes this from these other sightings. And this man was real. I'm not entirely sure how real the other wild men I've read about were. Certainly there were Adirondack hermits, many of them guides like sort of Alva Dunning and that kind of thing, which is a rather different matter from these wild men who appeared in the papers in the early part of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. Talk to us a little bit about you. In your talk, you said that by the time they went down and got a posse back, but they had already sort of created enough evidence, the rhetoric around who this person was, to justify his murder, to justify his lynching, it would appear. So they'd already constructed an identity of this man, as out of place, as criminalized, as pathologized, mm-hmm. already, to justify the killing of this man. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think so. Really what we have to go on is the report that the state troopers put together on the 9th, and they're looking backward and saying, okay, so Blanchard, and it was Blanchard allegedly who made this report, came in and said there was a wild man living in the woods, that he had deer hides on his feet instead of shoes, and he was leaving these strange tracks with the animal's hair stuck to them. And I think that was a part of the discourse that helped mobilize a posse, I don't know what else to call it, a group of men, a lynch mob, to go out into the woods and to track this guy down. They had already externalized him. They had already dehumanized him when they came out of the woods. Now, whether or not he sort of made any threat at all, I don't know. That's the statement was, he said, don't come any closer because I don't want to kill anyone, which doesn't sound very wild to me. But, that was the discourse that was woven around, and immediately by the newspapers as soon as they found out.
Okay. Now I have one question, but before, one more question from one of our attendees. But Benita Lau Diao mentioned and asked if it was possible for this man's body to be exhumed, right? And you said that possibly the case couldn't be reopened because there were no survivors, right? Now, did you find anyone to whom this story was passed down orally? Any of the family members or members of the posses?
I really haven't got into that part of the research yet. And I was kind of hoping that someone might get in touch. I advertised this talk and asked people on my Facebook page as the county historian, and I'm hoping that someone will. I'm aware of some of the rumors sort of third hand that, went on in terms of where this happened and the fact that they showed the body around, but I've not been able yet to interview people. That would have been this year, really, if it weren't for COVID, kind of putting the brakes on a lot of things. Mm-hmm. But that is certainly something I would like to know, if anything has been passed down in the families, if
Yes.
anyone expressed any regret or
Mm.
offered, you know, any other kind of explanation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I know with Emmett Till, the white female who had made the accusation against Emmett Till before she passed on, came forward and told the truth.
Yes, that's
right? Essentially about what happened. And so it's really important to speak with any descendants to find out what was passed on. And of course, you know, a lot of historians, as a historian, you know, a lot of the information or memory happens, right? Memory, and the information changes or gets added to. But it's really important to bring justice to this man, right? And the telling of the story is about bringing justice, about allowing him the humanity that he was denied. But I just want to mention too, there's do you know about the Cold Case Justice Institute at Syracuse University College of Law?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've worked with Paula Johnson, Dr. Johnson, for several years, and they have done a phenomenal job. So I would love to hear how they would see and process something like this. But I know a lot of times they work with descendants of Black and Brown peoples who have been, who were related to victims. Yeah, so I'm gonna bring one more question from our audience, and then I think we are about out of time. All right, so this one is from Paula Mayers again. Paul Mayers, I apologize. And Paul says, I also recently learned that there was a fairly large Black population in the North Country that was mostly run out by a strong KKK presence in the early part of the 20th century. Can you talk about that? Do you know anything about that?
I don't, actually. I am aware of some indications of Black Americans living in one town or another, you know, through just sort of obscure references in which that's not really the point. It's just sort of an aside. I don't know of a large Black population in Hamilton County. It's possible that north of here, that was the case. I can't speak to that phenomenon here in the county, and I don't believe the census can speak to that either. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, of course. But no, I'm not aware of that in sort of my part of the landscape, if you will.
Yeah, I've read in popular press about the KKK presence and running out of Black bodies, Black peoples from the region, but nothing that is substantiated by data and evidentiary support, right? That academics have sunk their teeth into. And so if anyone in the audience knows about any research that has been done that can give us some information on that, that would be great. We can even make it accessible on our website at the Adirondack Diversity Initiative. I'm gonna do one more question. And let's see, because the same people are asking the question, so I'm gonna give them the floor. So here we go. And this is from Benita again. If his DNA is done, they might find, and she's just making a comment, find some of his descendants who could shed some light on this. And so she's really going back to the question of whether or not he could be exhumed and a DNA can be done now and we can trace his descendants. Is that something possible?
Sure. And I saw another question sort of fly by. What is the point of this? That's part of the point. You know, somewhere a family lost a son. They lost a relative. They never would have found out what had happened to him. And so a part of the research is just, you know, even if there is no one alive still to answer for what happened, we have to answer to justice, I think. And part of that demands that we find out who this man was and contact any descendants or descendants of his relatives who might still be about and, you know, let them know what happened to their family member. And we need to know, you know, this is a part of our history. It's not one that I've seen discussed a lot in Hamilton County. And it's certainly something I think that shows us who we were and who we are. And it's something that we have to face. And it's painful, you know, it's going to be painful for the descendants, I think, of the people who were in this party. But I think we owe that to the past. We owe it to truth. And we owe it to the man who died in such a terrible way. If you can put yourself in this man's place for a moment, out in the wilderness, afraid, terrorized by people he didn't even know, and dying in that desolate place.
Mm-hmm.
I think that a historian, and I am the historian for this place, I am the public historian for this place, and I think it is my job to try to find out who he was and to restore his identity if possible. And
his humanity. And I think that I'm going to end because just because we're running out of time, but what's equally as powerful is the connections you've made between the past and the ways in which he was denied his humanity. Whatever humanity he has was stripped to justify his lynching. And looking at that rhetoric and making the correlation and the comparison between the rhetoric around how Black people are already positioned, already pathologized, already criminalized, so that when acts of policing or vigilante violence happen, it is seen as justifiable.
Yes.
Okay. We are already criminalized. So wiping us out is justified because we are a threat to the community. We're a threat to even our own communities. Okay. So I want to. Okay. So there are a lot of comments, wonderful comments, and another one that says it would be nice to bury him. Someone mentioned, Paul again mentioned that the story about the KKK is something he heard from his mother at the St. Lawrence County Historical Society. Right, so that's really great information, and thank you, Paul. All right, so as we close, I would like to thank Dr. Eliza Jane Darling for her work that she's doing. This is critically important work, especially because it unearths a past in the Adirondacks that can really give us information about how and why Black and brown bodies don't often feel safe in the wilderness. Okay, this is very, very important, and what we can do to ensure that all people feel welcome in the Adirondacks, which we should have access to. Okay, now let me just do some quick reminders. The next program in the series, the Black Experience in the Adirondacks, will be held on Tuesday, November 10th at 7 p.m. And it is titled A Matter of Faith, North Country Faith Leaders and Black Lives Matter. That's going to be a powerful, powerful program. Join faith leaders from 2 North Country congregations and hear about the work their churches are doing in support of Black Lives Matter. Dr. Terry Lindsay, who was most recently the VP of Student Affairs and Campus Life at Paul Smith College, will be leading the discussion with Reverend Katrina Hebb and Reverend James T. Sinsky, I apologize, Reverend James, about why they and their congregations have felt compelled to take a position on the BLM movement, what they've been doing, what the response to their efforts has been, and future actions. We look forward to having you join us then. Thank you and good night. I want to thank the Adirondack Experience. I want to thank the Adirondack North Country Association. I want to thank my friends and family and my Adirondack fam. I want to thank the core team of the Adirondack Diversity Initiative, who are a powerful group of allies, accomplices, and co-conspirators who you would want to ride or die for. So I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Dr. Darling. Thank you so much for your time and your research. It's valuable and critical, not just for the Adirondacks, but for all communities to know what we did, who we are, and who we can be when it comes to our shared humanity. Thank you so much. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.